remember?
Jesus.
That's good.
Got you.
Elijah, he's been taking.
Yes,
notes.
thank
We've
you.
been taking notes, yeah,
Yes,
for sure.
he has. He didn't even have paper in front of him, so.
That was
Okay, so
memory.
we talked about Elijah, and we were in Revelation chapter 11, and we just looked at verse 3. So turn with me to Revelation 11 and to verse 3. And I want to pick up what I didn't have, what we weren't able to do last week, and then we're going to finish this section about these two people, and we're done until August at some point in time. Okay, so what does verse 3 say?
By faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command.
So that was for free, but you're in Hebrews.
Oh,
Jump to Revelation.
Wow.
I know, that was free.
That's a
It
good
was
one, though.
Hebrews 11, but
It's a
It's a different translation.
I thought that's really appropriate.
yeah, it is. We're gonna go there. So you can, when I point to you, you can read that
Yeah.
again, okay?
Okay, what am I going to?
Revelation 11, verse 3.
And verse 3.
Yes.
And I will give power to my two witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth.
Okay, so we've got two people, and last week we talked about Elijah. Today we're going to talk about Moses, and we said that in introducing Elijah, it's true for Moses. He says these two people, and I want to say this. I ended last week in saying a lot of people do think these two witnesses are Elijah and Moses. Some think it's another person, which we'll go into, but they're different ideas. But I think we're going to have at least an idea that whoever these two people are, they have that same spirit of Elijah and Moses as we look at their lives. Okay? So, what is the call on their lives?
To be prophets.
They're prophets, and a prophet does what?
Prophesy.
Prophets.
Oh, good job.
Witness.
A prophet does two things.
Witness and
Tells the future.
Tell the future and
Reveals truth.
just, declares God's truth. They're a spokesperson for God, and they're just in declaring the truth. So that's what their role is. That's what they'll do. And then they also are to be what?
Witnesses.
A witness. And we said last week that a witness is what?
Someone who sees it.
Yeah.
Sees it, experiences it.
Yes, absolutely. Or someone who gets that from someone who was an eyewitness. So, and we looked at the care that God put into His Word and carefully passing that on to the disciples first and then to other people. And so we looked at some of those verses last week as well. Okay, the other thing that they, in verse 7, I believe, yes, verse 7, there's a word there that describes part of what they do. What is that word?
Testimony.
Yes, it is. It's a testimony. What's the difference? And they are different. Different words are used. They're related, but they're different. What is a testimony?
It's when you tell the story according to you, what you witnessed and what you saw and what you did and what you saw somebody do. Or
Okay, so it's more than that. Go more than that.
Something that
In a
was
court of
there.
law.
It's involved. It's the experience.
It's the experience.
It's my experience with the truth. It's my experience with Jesus. That's my testimony. And we looked at Elijah's testimony last week. And what did we see about his testimony? So
Well, he was pursued. They were trying to kill him for prophesizing.
yes, absolutely. So he declared, that's his witness, he declared God's truth to Ahab the king. And so then it didn't rain for 3.5 years. That was part of what he declared to Ahab. He hit the road. God told him hit the road because Ahab was after him. And then after 3.5 years, God sends him back to Ahab And then what happens between him and Ahab? Remember?
They compete with the altars.
Exactly. There was a competition between the false prophets and him. And that competition was, and remember he mocked them and said,
The
"Oh,
burning
yeah.
altars.
yeah, dance around the altar, your God might be sleeping, get loud." You know, that whole kind of mocking thing for hours. It was an all-day event, and nothing happened. And then he wet the altar and called down fire from heaven, and God torched the altar. And the whole point of that was what? You remember what the whole point of that was?
To prove it was real.
To prove that God was real, and he was speaking to the northern tribe of the nation of Israel who was not following God. And he told them, choose, and they were quiet. And then after this, then they moved in that direction. And that was the whole point of what was going on. And then when the king got home, wifey says, and I stole that word from you,
Oh,
wifey says,
I had his head.
says, I'm going to kill it. And then what was his response to that?
He ran.
Took off
He's
the
gonna
clothes,
run.
yeah.
Yeah, and where was he?
He was in Jerusalem?
Not in Jerusalem.
He was in the northern kingdom.
We didn't say a place, but what I'm asking by where was he personally?
He was afraid.
He was terrified. And he really just, take my life. And this is like 2 back-to-back life-threatening events. It was real for him. And although he did this, God used him in this powerful way, then in this experience, he's afraid and he's running. And that is part of his story. That's part of his testimony. And as we go through things in life, sometimes we're afraid. And we feel bad on top of being afraid. And we feel bad in those places where God has to grow our faith. And yet it's encouraging for us to see that someone like Elijah went through that same process with God. That's part of our story. It's not a part of our story that we'd like to have the story that said, yeah, I stood my ground and I stared fear in the face and I just walked with God through, we like that kind of a story, but God is growing the person and he has to grow us as people as well as, and our faith, as well as our purpose. Those are 2 different things. And so we might know more, all of us know more truth than is applied to our life, and we might be able to say truth, but somewhere in there we're still growing. And it's a lifetime. So sometimes our testimony isn't syncing with our witness because we have to grow. And that's real. And it's not something we should go, oh, I shouldn't be that way. Yeah, we're people. And we need to grow. And we need to grow in our faith. And we should normalize some failure. Not that we want it. We don't. But we should normalize that as part of the process that God puts us through for change. So that our testimony and our witness are more in line with each other. So that's really what our lesson was last time. And today we're going to look at Moses, and we're going to look at some of the things that he goes through. And there's definitely parallels between Elijah and Moses. And the nice thing about Moses, we don't have to spend too much time in the Old Testament because Hebrews 11 actually writes about Moses. And we don't know who wrote Hebrews, but there's a section in there where he talks about Moses. And there's some things that we don't know where he got that information, but he's going to reveal some information that we may not have heard before. Then Stephen, when he was getting himself in trouble, he has a big section of his communication is about Moses. So we're going to go to those 2 places. And the first one is Hebrews 11. And we're actually going to come back to the verse you read. Yes, sir.
I got a quick question before we jump into this.
Okay.
On the verse that we just read in Revelations,
Uh-huh.
what is the significance to say that they were going to witness and prophesy in clothed in sackcloth?
That's a good question. Okay, so how long are they going to do it?
3.5 years.
3.5 years. And anytime you see sackcloth, there's grief attached, there's mourning, So it is the times that they are speaking into,
Okay.
and so that's exactly why they're
I figured
wearing
it was
sackcloth.
significant
Yes.
because, well, that's what he said it.
Yeah, and they're wearing it the whole time, and they're communicating for God to Israel.
Okay.
So yeah,
Is it literally like just cloth draped?
yeah, it'd be like those like
Burlap.
sacks. Yeah, thank you, burlap. That would be the right idea of that.
Ouch.
Yeah,
That's
right.
pretty scratchy.
3.5 years. Yeah. Okay, so let's read. Let's read Hebrews 11, 23 through 23 through 29.
By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born, because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God, rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who he is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and the application of blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel.
Okay, so we have a list of things that describe Moses. And how would you, and again, it's in this chapter of Hebrews, which is, hey, God's listing people, and look at verse, what did you read verse?
29 is, by faith the
Oh.
people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land.
Yeah.
But when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned.
Okay, so we have all these events. It's kind of a summary of these events in Moses' life. And what do we find out? What are those events that the author of Hebrews
His
describes?
parents hid him for 3 months when he was first born,
Okay, and why did they do that?
because they said he wasn't like an ordinary child.
Well, because the Pharaoh was wanting to kill the little
Yes,
boy.
and that's true.
That's why
Okay,
they were hiding.
yes, that's why they hid him. But they did it. Why did they do it?
By faith.
Yes. This was an action based on faith. Okay, what else? What's the next thing that we see about him?
When he had grown up, he refused to be known as the Pharaoh's daughter,
Son.
or son. As a
Or
son,
son of the
yeah,
Pharaoh's
as
daughter.
the
Yeah, I was
son
like,
of the Pharaoh's daughter,
Okay, and instead, what did he choose?
to be mistreated.
Oppression.
Depending on who, is that right? Depending on who was the king at the time, he may have been second in line. So that really sets that in contrast of, okay, he might have been, when he's making this choice, and definitely as we read this, there are conscious choices being made to operate in faith. Okay? In each situation, there's a conscious choice being made to operate in faith. Okay, so this was what he refused, and then what did he choose?
Slavery.
And specifically, he did what?
Game,
His people.
yeah, known as a Jew.
Okay, and what else? What else do we see?
It says he chose to be mistreated rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin.
So this was a conscious choice to suffer in the face of what was going to be his heritage, what he'd been trained for. Okay, so then what else do we see? What was part of that choice?
Regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ.
Well, yes, that was part of it. That definitely is part of it. But look at verse 26. What do we find there?
That it was better to suffer for God's sake than his own treasure took Egypt.
Well, he was looking for the heavenly reward.
Okay. So that was part of his perspective here. It wasn't a temporary reward. And that's part of what, again, he's making conscious choices. He's looking to the future. He's looking to heaven. And he's making a choice based on that. And he also had an understanding. What's the understanding that he had? The choice was also what?
To me, he had some knowledge or understanding of Christ because the author of Hebrews says he considered the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures
Of Egypt. So how would he have known about Christ?
Didn't he go back to live with his birth mom after the Pharaoh's daughter?
Yes,
Like
she
adopted?
raised him. That's exactly right. And she took him home for a while, and she spent time with him. There's no question about that. So we don't know exactly, but he spent time with his mom, and they were people of faith. And she had a sense of his significance, and so she put truth into his heart. That's exactly right.
Well, and to me, that's even unbelievable in and of itself because Christ wasn't born yet.
Right. But
He'd been prophesied.
exactly. And where are we first? Before Adam and Eve get the boot out of the garden, Jesus is talked about. And then in Genesis chapter 12, first 3 verses, Abraham is promised 3 things. What are the 3 things that I'm getting ahead of myself? Somewhere that's later in my notes. But what was the 3 things that Abraham was promised?
He's going to be the father of many nations.
Yep. And at that point he's childless, many nations. What else?
That
Promise.
his heirs would be greater than the stars or
Okay,
something like that.
all right, so there's, exactly, what else? 3 things.
The land.
Yep, the land specifically, and in Genesis 15, when God's talking to him, he maps out the entire land. He tells him exactly the borders of that land, which they've never occupied. Never occupied the complete borders of that land. And what was the other thing they promised?
And he would be his God and they would be his people.
Yes, that is part of it, but he promised them something specifically. We'll go to Galatians 3 just to finish this.
That's the first line.
Is it children?
This is children.
Okay.
Keep
Base
on
it
going.
at the,
How about
base it
that?
at,
Yes, you can buy a vow.
Blessing.
He'll bless those who bless him and curse those who curse him.
Yes, and that's what she said, but all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And turn with me to Galatians 3:16, and we're going to get an explanation by Paul as to what is meant by that.
Now the promises were spoken to Abraham and to his seed. He does not say and to seeds as referring to many, but rather to one, and to your seed, that is Christ.
Okay, so he knew. And again, Jesus was going to be born, and we can go back farther, and we can see prophetic statements about Jesus coming through the bloodline of the Jewish nation. And so somehow we get a real sense from what the Hebrew author wrote is that Moses had an understanding of that. He had an understanding of the gospel. And just like Paul writes in Romans, is that Abraham believed God, and that was credited to him as righteousness. It was his belief, it was not his works. His belief in Jesus coming in the future. Okay.
Still phenomenal in the fact that the Jews, most of them didn't believe that, that his parents did.
Yes, that is. And we can just see the care and the plan and protection of God in the faith. Okay, so what did he do next? What did he do next after this? And again, each one of these was a choice, but it was a choice based on faith. God, I believe that you're telling me the truth. What was the next thing?
He left Egypt.
Yep. He left Egypt and
Not fearing the wrath of the king.
what do we see was behind that?
Faith.
Yep, he endured what?
Because he's seen him who is unseen.
Um,
Because of his faith in
yes.
God.
So all these things that he did, and this is part of his testimony, this is part of his story, he did because of God, because of the truth, because he trusted what God said, and he made choices based on that. And that's what we're seeing in his life. So we see he had a heritage, and then we see the steps that he took. So how would you describe Moses as a person? How would you describe him?
Faithful.
How else?
Bold.
How else?
I can't see what you're writing.
Oh, I'm sorry. Man of God, bold, faithful. I need to erase this.
Brave.
Brave. What else?
Working.
Working. What else?
Knowledgeable, or a personal understanding of who Christ was, or God was.
Okay. What else? I'm not trying to do that.
I think for people around him in the day, it would have been confusing, really, to know his lineage and worldly what he was giving up. It would be, so I would think the audience, his peer, it would be confusing to them.
Okay, and actually we're gonna go, when we go to Acts, we're gonna look into that a little bit here in just a second. So, okay, so that could be.
And that's not who he was.
Yeah, got you, I got it, that's okay. All right, so we know that he had a perspective that was based on what? It's based on faith, but also what was that perspective based on?
Teachings.
It was. Oh, that's true. Remember when he said he looked to the future? How?
Prophecy.
Yes, okay, prophecy. But he looked to the future. And by looking to the future, it impacted his choice today. How does that same thing happen for us? Huh?
Not very well.
We have to be able to recognize biblical things when they happen, I guess. We have to know Christ or know God.
Well, and he, in his perspective, he knew the future. He knew that there was a reward and it was in heaven. And so he could bypass here because of the future, because of the reward in heaven. And that shaped his choices. And it is a strong reminder for us that everything that we're dealing with here is what? It's temporary. But do we live that way? Do we live
I mean, the Jews knew that Christ was coming.
right,
And they still believe he's coming.
right.
So it's not like they didn't know who he was.
That's
They just didn't recognize him when he was here.
that is exactly right. Okay, so and then we saw that he endured, and we often don't think that we as believers need to endure, but over and over again we see that we are going to face things in life, and those things are hard, and that God is going, and even Paul in Colossians 1, we need to go there. I think it's verse 9, but it would fit with this. Colossians 1, maybe 9. No, verse 11. Look at verse 11.
Colossians 1.
Colossians 1, verse 11. What do we see there about endurance?
Strengthened with all might according to his glorious power, for all patience and long suffering with joy.
Okay, so he's praying this for these guys, and he's praying that they will be strengthened with power for attaining of steadfastness and patience. We don't often pray that, but this was what Paul was praying for them. Was they would be steadfast and patient. And we all need this, because our trials always last longer than we want to. And so we need, and God is growing us through the pressure of our trials. And so he's praying for them, that they would be steadfast and patient and be strengthened in that place. And it's such a weak feeling place. Okay, let's read Deuteronomy 34:10. There's a description of Moses in Deuteronomy 34:10.
Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face.
Okay, so what do we find out about Moses as a prophet?
He was the best.
He was the best. There was no one like him. Okay? All right, let's turn to Acts 7. And again, this is Stephen talking right before he was stoned. And this is what gets him in trouble, is how he communicates to this group of leadership. And let's see, Acts 7, 17 to 22.
But as the time of this promise was approaching, which God had assured to Abraham, the people increased and multiplied in Egypt, until there arose another king over Egypt who knew nothing about Joseph. It was he who took shrewd advantage of our race and mistreated our fathers, so that they would expose their infants, that they would not survive. And it was at this time that Moses was born, and he was lovely in the sight of God, and he was nurtured 3 months in his father's home. And after he had been exposed, Pharaoh's daughter took him away and nurtured him as her own son. And Moses was educated in all of the learning of the Egyptians, and he was a man of power in words and deeds.
Okay, so we find out that basically a little bit more detail about his early life here. Okay, what do we find out about his early life?
He was raised in luxury.
Yep.
And educated.
Because even his parents were servants to the royal family.
Yeah, they were.
So it wasn't like they were like out in the field or out on the breaking rocks and pushing stuff around. They were working in the palace.
His mom.
Yeah, his mom.
Yes, that's exactly right. So we see him raised in luxury, he's educated, and he's prepared. And he's being prepared to lead, because this is the daughter's son. So let's go on and let's read some more of the story, and it's 23 through 28. What do we see? Well, we read 22. Oh yeah, 23.
But when he was approaching the age of 40, it entered his mind to visit his brethren, the sons of Israel. And when he saw one of them being treated unjustly, he defended him and took vengeance for the oppressed by striking down the Egyptian. And he supposed that his brethren understood that God was granting them deliverance through him, but they did not understand. And on the following day, he appeared to them as they were fighting together, and he tried to reconcile them in peace, saying, Men, you are brethren, why do you injure one another? But the one who was injuring his neighbor pushed him aside, saying, Who made you a ruler and judge over us? You did not mean to kill me, as you killed the Egyptian yesterday, do you?
Okay, so now we have an event that's going to trigger a change in Moses' life. Okay, how old was he?
40.
He was 40. So he has spent 40 years in that environment. Okay? Now, what are some of the details that we find out in this next event that is Stephen describes?
Then he kills an Egyptian that was abusing some Jewish workers.
Yeah, he just went to go see him.
He went out to,
Yep, and so then he kills an Egyptian who is abusing a Jew. And what was behind that?
Protecting the Jews.
Okay? But what did Moses think by this action, the action that he took? What did Moses think?
he thought that, he thought that the Jews would respect him for doing it and look up to him.
He did, because what was in him?
Love for
God.
Yeah.
Yes, but
He had vengeance in it. You know?
Well, they thought God was using him to rescue them.
exactly. God was putting into him what verse 25 says. And what does verse 25 say?
God was granting them deliverance through him, but they did not understand it.
Yeah, but he had a sense of, hey, this is what I'm supposed to do. This is what my training was for. This is what I'm supposed to do. And they didn't understand. They didn't see that about him. In fact, how do they respond to him the next day when he shows up?
I think they resented him.
Okay.
Well,
They were kind of ridiculing him, saying, "Are you going to kill me like you did that Egyptian?"
Okay. And how do they look at what they say in verse 27? And he's trying to tell them, hey, don't fight with each other. And look at verse 27, and what did they say to him?
Ask him who made him ruler.
Yeah. Who made you in charge? Is basically what their feedback too. And that was their attitude toward him when he's thinking, God is raising me up to deliver you, and your response is this. Okay, so let's look at verse 29.
And at this remark Moses fled and became an alien in the land of Midian, where he became the father of 2 sons.
Okay, and then verse 30, how long was he there?
40 years.
40 years. So we have this 40 years, we have this event that triggered him to run, and if we look at, is it Exodus 3:1? Yes, would somebody read Exodus 3:1? So we find out he goes to Midian, and how is he described as being in Midian? How do you spell it?
Alien.
No.
M-I-D-I-A-N.
M-I-D-I-A-N?
Yeah.
Okay. And he was an alien there. He wasn't at home. Didn't feel like he belonged. He ran because he killed an Egyptian, and he spends 40 years here. But what does Exodus 3:1 tell us that he did? What was his job?
He had 2 sons.
He was a shepherd.
He was a shepherd.
That's right.
Okay. And then we do know that he got married, and he had 2 sons. Why a shepherd?
I guess he was learning how to lead people. I don't know.
That's exactly right. He's spending 40. Now, when we look at this, he tries to, really, when he did that, he was ahead of God's timing. When he thought he was going to deliver them, he wasn't ready. He was ahead of God's timing. And so God puts him through this process to prepare him to lead.
So the first one, it wasn't God's will that it was happening. It
But
might
he
have
had
been
it in his
eventually.
heart that that's what God was calling him to do. But he took, I'm sure no one else in this room could identify with that. That you take action ahead of God and you think that you're doing exactly what God, I got this, God. I'm doing this. This is what you're putting in my heart. And yet, what he doesn't know is that God has to prepare the man. And so he makes him a shepherd because why, Dan?
So he could lead people. So he could understand.
And what kind of people was he going to lead?
Stubborn.
Stubborn.
Just like sheep.
Exactly. What other kind of thing? How else would we describe these people he's going to lead?
Stupid.
Stupid. Okay. True.
Sheep are stupid.
They are stupid. And the people he's going to lead were going to whine and cry all the time. And they're going to complain all the
Gonna
time.
make noise.
And they're just going to be, they're going to want, yes, and they're going to want to go back. This is the kind of people that he's going to be dealing with for how long?
40 years.
40 years. So this is 40 years. So we know he had 40 years, 40 years, and 40 years. This is how his life was
So
divided.
they're 120 years old.
Yeah. And so he needed this 40 years of preparation. Preparation is sometimes feels pretty meaningless because we want to be on to something. But again, we see that he's a witness. He has a testimony. And this is God growing the man for the job that God planned for him to have. We can't always appreciate or see that in our life. And again, sometimes it's like the clock ticks backwards in some of these situations where God is preparing us or changing us or enabling us to be the right kind of person in whatever things that he's planned for us. We don't appreciate this process. I don't know how he felt, but we do know how he felt when God talked to him. So let's go back to Acts 7:30.
And when 40 years had passed, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in the flame of a fire in a bush in the wilderness of Mount Sinai. When Moses saw it,
Did you catch that? It's been a long time since I've read that. Here he is in the wilderness of Mount Sinai. It's like this is his backyard.
he's been going around and around and around the same area. For 40 years.
Exactly. So even when he goes there, he's familiar with, I just don't remember that. It's been so long since I read that. But anyway, go ahead.
When Moses saw it, he marveled at the sight, and as he drew near to observe, the voice of the Lord came to him, saying, I am God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses trembled and dared not look. Then the Lord said to him, Take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground. I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their groaning and have come down to deliver them. And now come, I will send you to Egypt. This Moses, whom they rejected, saying, Who made you a ruler and a judge, is the one God sent to be a ruler and a deliverer by the hand of the angel who appeared to him in the bush. He brought them out. He brought them out after he had shown wonders and signs in the land of Egypt, and in the Red Sea, and in the wilderness for 40 years. This is that Moses who said to the children of Israel, The Lord your God will raise you up for a prophet like me for your brethren. Him you shall hear. This is he who was in the congregation in the wilderness with the angel who spoke to him on Mount Sinai, and with our fathers, the one who received the living oracles to give to us.
Okay, so this is God's encounter, and here's where Moses was for 40 years. Now, let's look at some of the dialogue that we can see in Exodus 3, those verses there, Exodus 3, 11 and 12, 4:1 and 4:10. We're going to see some of the dialogue that Moses had with God. And what do we see?
But Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" And God, am I reading right?
Yes, you are.
Okay. And God said, "I will be with you, and this will be a sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain."
Okay, so here he also says something else about Mount Sinai here. What does he say?
After you bring the people out, you're gonna worship me here.
Yeah, okay. And then, but what does Moses say, and what's profound about what Moses says to God when God tells him this is what he wants him to do?
He protested it.
Okay, and what did he say?
Who am I that I should be the one?
Okay, what did we read earlier, just a few verses earlier in Acts? What did Moses think that they would know?
He was the deliverer.
He was the deliverer. And so in the obscurity of being an alien in a foreign country and spending time with sheep and all of that situation, what happened?
He lost his confidence.
Yes, he did. In himself. And we need that. So that we do trust God. So that we do take steps of faith. So that we do respond to his leadership.
So it was to lose the confidence that got in the way of God.
Yeah, and it also made him go out ahead of God, and the timing was not God's timing. And if we would go back and we'd read Genesis 15, God tells them they're going to be there 400 years. And they're approaching that 400-year mark, which is, this is God's timing. But the man had to be prepared because he was going to represent God and talk for God to these people over and over and over again. And what would happen to his character in the environment that he was in for those 40 years? What would happen to his character? We know he lost his confidence.
He's humbled.
He's humbled.
But not in necessarily a bad way.
No.
Not like you're humbled and you're broken and defeated.
And I think he probably questioned whether that was still his mission or not.
It
been
sounds
40
like
years-
it.
40 years ago.
Yeah.
I mean, I think about the times that we struggle, and we go through the hard times, and we do lose confidence. Oh, I lost my train of thought, sorry, never mind.
That's because you're older than me. We do, but we do lose confidence. But some of God is using sandpaper on us so that we really can be vessels that he can use. And it's uncomfortable. Go ahead.
So that in that weakness, when we aren't confident, then we are more dependent
Yes.
upon the Father.
Yes.
That's what I was trying to say.
And his entire role for 40
Yes.
years was so much dependence on God. Because, and the other thing that had to come in there is a whole lot of endurance and a whole lot of patience.
Because while they're in the desert, they basically relied on locusts and manna and stuff from God that disappeared in one day. And they couldn't find any other food any other way.
That's true, and he also had to deal with the people, which would tax his patience beyond, I mean, because it's like really, and it's not just one person, it's the whole lot of them.
They'd all go like this way, and then you go, okay, come back, oh, this way.
Was he depending on himself more than God?
In this situation, I think he was, because he thought he was going to be their deliverer, and he just stepped out and did it, and it was not God's timing, which is why God sent him to the wilderness. He needed his character refined. He wasn't ready, and it wasn't God's timing. But he had a sense in his heart, this is my purpose. He had a sense of that. Okay, so let's look at 4:1 and 4:10. Let's see a little more dialogue between Moses and God.
Moses answered, "What if they do not believe me or listen to me and say, the Lord did not appear to you?"
Okay, and he goes on and he does the staff, but what is the other question that Moses has?
Moses said to the Lord, "Pardon your servant, Lord. I have never been eloquent neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue."
So what is Moses doing when God's calling him to go?
Making excuses.
Yeah. He is, in his mind, he is unprepared. And if we ever, God tells us to do something, and we do the exact same thing, and we come up with all these reasons why we're not that person,
All the time.
we do. And so and this is part of his story. This is part of his testimony. This is part of God using a person to accomplish his purposes. And what it takes to be prepared for what God has. Okay, let's see. And then he also says, go back to Acts 7. What does he say in verse 37? I don't have time to dig into that, but who's he referring to in verse 37?
This is the Moses who said to the children of Israel, "The Lord your God will raise you up, will raise up for you a prophet like me from your brethren. Him shall you hear." It's talking about Jesus.
Yes, he is. He is talking about Jesus, and he's quoting Deuteronomy. And he's talking about Jesus, and the reason he's talking about Jesus is because there's parallels between the way Moses was functioned and how Jesus functioned. There are parallels. And so, anyway, and then in verse 39, what does verse 38, what do we see that he points to? What is he describing?
So he's talking about the person who was with the angel in the burning bush.
Okay, and what does he say happened? What event happened is he describing in verse 38?
He received living oracles to pass on to you.
Okay, so what is he referring to?
I have no idea.
Yeah, the Ten Commandments.
Okay.
Yeah, and those living oracles, remember Jesus summed up those 10 Commandments to
Two.
love, the two, and what are they?
Love God with all your
Love,
heart. Yeah.
okay,
Love God,
love God and love people. And so this is the living oracles that he's describing for him, that Stephen is referring to. Interesting, he's talking to church leadership who's actually gonna stone him here shortly. Why do you think he talked about those things? This is just a side thing.
Just to remind everybody what the Lord has done.
Okay, that is part of it for sure. But how did the people respond to Moses? They rejected him and his leadership, and he's doing all this conversation and leading up to the fact that they, as a religious body, have what?
Failed.
Yes, but what did they do with Jesus?
Lost sight of God.
They
They
rejected
rejected
Jesus.
him.
Jesus was not the Messiah. So he's drawing a parallel, and they know it. He's drawing a parallel between Moses and his relationship with the nation of Israel and Jesus and his relationship with the nation of Israel. So that's just a little side note there. Okay, why was Moses' leadership so vital to the nation and to God's plan?
Say it one more time.
Why was Moses' leadership so vital to the nation and to God's plan?
Because it was another picture of the Christ that was coming. And
Okay.
the reason he was coming.
That's part of it,
Be
for
their
sure.
deliverer.
Okay? That's definitely part of it. Let's read these three places, and I think it will give us Exodus 3:6, 15, and 4:5. It will certainly help us. And Stephen actually quoted one of these at the beginning. What do we see in 3:6?
He said, "All also, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Then Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God.
Okay, and then look at verse 15. What does he say there?
God furthermore said to Moses, thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial name to all generations.
Okay, and then look at 4:10. 4:5, excuse me.
That they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has appeared to you.
Why does he reference his lineage? And I'm asking that to answer the question, why was his leadership so vital to the nation?
Because those were important people in like the history.
That was what?
They were like important people in the history.
They were, and he's related to them.
To remind him where
Were
he
they
came
the
from.
lineage of Christ?
That's part of it. That is part of it. And that it definitely is a big reason why his role was so important as Jesus. But what is he referencing there?
He's always been their God.
Okay?
Show
True.
them where that came from.
True. He's referencing what? That he promised Abraham, that he promised Jacob, that he promised, what is he referencing?
That he's appeared to them.
That's true.
Give us a hint.
Have anything to do with the father of many nations
Which was part of the Abrahamic covenant. This is part of God fulfilling the covenant that he made with Abraham. And so that's why this leadership is so important. He promised Abraham land. He promised him children. Here's a bunch of children from Abraham. And he promised him that Jesus would come through this nation. And he is fulfilling the promise of the Messiah. And so that's why when God introduces himself, he is talking about the covenant that he made with Abraham, that he made with their family. And he's talking about the fact that land is involved. And he's talking about the fact that the Messiah is involved. That's why his leadership is so important. They had to get to their land. Why did they have to get to their land?
Because it was promised.
It was promised, and there are events that are going to take place in that land that have been prophesied about Jesus and about other things. And so, and we're still living with some of those unfulfilled that we've been reading about in Revelation.
So when he goes down through that lineage, time and time again, he's basically telling Moses, you're the one.
Yeah, he is. This is what, you're the one, you're going to do this. And yeah, that's exactly right. So why did they, I don't remember how far Mount Sinai is from Israel, but I don't think it's very far. And they spent 40 years wandering around. And this isn't in our notes, and we're only going to read a couple more verses because of time. But why were they wandering around 40 years?
because they didn't go into the promised land.
Yeah, they had an opportunity to go in. 12 spies went in, and how many of them said, this is great? Two. And 10 said, no, they're big. We can't conquer them. So those 10 died in the wilderness, and all that generation died. And it was the next generation with Caleb and Joshua that were able to go into the promised land 40 years later. And this is part of their wandering around, is Moses having to lead these people in this environment. Okay, let's look at the verse Exodus 33:11 is God spoke to Moses face to face. And we see that part of his testimony is that he had a personal relationship with God. And he had that relationship that was growing, as well as his witness about God to the people. When they crossed Exodus 14, when they crossed the Red Sea, Moses said to the people, and this is the leadership. I mean, they're crossing through water, and it's dry, and they're these walls of water. And here's what Moses says to them: do not fear. Stand by and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians you have seen today, you will never see again. That's leadership. That's what he was growing for those 40 years before this moment. And his confidence and trust in God was showing on full display during a scary thing. I don't know. I've never walked through walls of water before. Okay, so let's turn to Numbers 23 through 7. There's a couple of times where Moses provided water. To the nation. They're in a desert. And this is the second time. And let's see what happened.
The people thus contended with Moses and spoke, saying, if only we had perished when our brothers perished before the Lord. Why then have you brought the Lord's assembly into the wilderness for us and our beasts to die here? And why have you made us come up from Egypt to bring us into this wretched place? It is a place of grain. It is not a place of grain or figs or vines or pomegranates, nor is there water to drink. Then Moses and Aaron came in from the presence of the assembly to the doorway of the tent of meeting and fell on their faces, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying,
Okay, so I want to point out there, and we'll read the rest of it here, but listen to what they're saying to him. And this is not just one pass. This is nonstop for 40 years. But what was Moses' response in the face of that?
went and prayed.
Yes, he went and prayed. We saw that about Elijah. We see that about Moses. That's part of that dependence upon God. And this is a challenging situation. They're challenging him. And they're questioning who he is and what he's doing and why he's doing it. And this is hard. Okay, so let's read 8 through 12.
Take the staff, and you and your brother Aaron gather the assembly together. Speak to the rock before their eyes, and it will pour out its water. You will bring water out of the rock for the community so that they and their livestock can drink. So Moses took the staff from the Lord's presence, just as he commanded him. He and Aaron gathered the assembly together in front of the rock, and Moses said to them, listen, you rebels, must we bring you water out of this rock? Then Moses raised his arm and struck the rock twice with his staff. Water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank. How far?
12.
But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I gave them.
Okay, so in the face of that, God said, do this, he does it, do this, he does it, and then when he's supposed to speak to the rock, he whacks it twice, and water comes out. Okay, and so what was God's response to him doing, and why do you think he did it?
He was angry.
He's probably angry.
You rebels, I'm so sick and tired of you. And so he became impatient, he became angry. And what was God's response? Which seems kind of harsh. Maybe
They will
tough.
never see the promised land.
Yeah, he doesn't get to go into the promised land. And why? God tells him exactly why in 12.
He didn't honor God.
Yeah, he didn't honor him. And he didn't what?
Listen.
Yeah, he didn't trust him. So Moses still had growth as a person. In this moment of what should have been triumph, close to entering Israel. And he doesn't get to do that because of how he treated.
And he was in his 80s probably.
120.
120-ish.
Yeah.
Somewhere in there.
Yeah, he's 120 at this point. And so if that verse in Deuteronomy 34, 5 and 6 is going to say that God buried Moses in Moab. and nobody knew where his grave to this day. They have no idea where his grave. So when we think about Moses and we think about Elijah, and you know, we've kind of talked about it at the beginning, what thoughts come to mind when it goes, what can we learn? What can we learn from Moses and Elijah that we can apply to our lives right now?
Things happen in God's time.
Things happen in God's time.
Depend on him fully.
Say it again.
Depend on him fully.
And what about that dependence? What do we find out about dependence? What do we find out about dependence?
That we need to trust him.
Yes. And God kind of forces these guys to depend on him. God strips them of stuff to make them trust him. We kind of will put that weight on ourselves as like, we've got to do this, and it's almost like God knows that we don't. And God puts them in positions to grow the trust, like he puts us in positions to grow trust. We're forced to learn to depend. Whether it's like Moses, well, I stepped out ahead of you on that one, or you know, taking care of sheep for 40 years, whatever, to grow that trust to the point where he didn't even think that that's his call anymore. Anything else? What else can we learn from these two that are practical for us today?
I think the sense of don't be defeated if you're not perfect your own self as you walk down this road. Because, I mean, Moses speaking with God himself.
Exactly.
And still had problems.
Yes.
In that walk.
Yes, and it's a statement at the end of his life, not just one at the beginning of his life. In that there's failure and there's growth. There's failure and there's growth. And that's what God is put them through and is putting us through. And we can spend a lot of time dwelling on failure. Let's waste another 20 years on failure. And instead of recognizing that's part of being a person, it's part of God loving us and participating. He knew it. He knew it about you. He knows it about me. But he fully participates, knowing that that's true. What else? Anything else? Just a couple of things that I wrote down. They cared about people. They cared about these people to put them through a lot of stuff, but they cared about these people. Elijah did, he did. God's plans and purposes for them never changed. He continued to grow them, and their need for growth and change and trust never stopped. And they learned to live by faith. We learn to live by faith as we walk through the challenges that we face. And I think then there's a shift of responsibility for outcomes. We sometimes will bear responsibility for outcomes. We don't bear the responsibility for the outcomes. We need to follow, and we need to let him bear the responsibility for those outcomes, which takes some pressure off of us. And they both had a really high calling, and it was hard. And they accepted it. But it was hard. Anything else? Okay, let's close. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for telling us about Elijah and Moses, and thank you for the ways that we can look at their lives and have a better understanding of the challenges that we walk through in our faith. Father, we do need you to grow our trust. We do need you to help us to look to you. We do need you to provide us with the strength that we need. We need you to remind us of the truth and to remember that failure is part of it. And Father, in our failure that we would confess to you and also allow you to move us forward because your purposes and plans don't change. God, sometimes we don't value character as much as we do our pleasure. Forgive us for that. Please continue to shape our character. In Jesus' name I pray.